Well, Hilary Jacobs Hendel, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio, or perhaps I should say welcome back, because we made a real effort at this a week ago, and there were a host of technical issues that got in the way, so welcome.
Thank you, David. I'm thrilled to be here talking
Yeah,
to you,
good.
talking with everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, as I said last time, I'm so happy to have you on the show. And you have a very interesting background. We got started on the conversation last time, and as I recall, you come from a pretty accomplished family, and then you've gone through a very fascinating academic route of studies and degrees and so on. So fill us in a bit on your very interesting life.
Oh, gosh. Well, thank you. I don't know about that, but you're referring to, well, just being a science person, and started out, my dad was a psychiatrist, and
Right.
my mother was a guidance counselor. So I grew up in a very psychologically aware household. And I thought I wanted to be a physician like my father from the time I was 3 years old. And I got a lot of positive reinforcement for that.
I'll bet.
In a Jewish family, it's like if you grow up to be a doctor, that's a wonderful mitzvah. It's a great thing. So
Yeah.
I was good, and I was good at science. And the relevance here of my science ability and the science education, I went to Bronx High School of Science, and then I was a biochemistry major at Wesleyan University. And then I went on, I actually decided to become a dentist instead of a physician. And
Now, why was that?
well, basically, to make a long story short, and I wrote about this in the book because I think it's important. I'm sure I'm not alone in this, that becoming a doctor, when you say you're going to be a doctor at 3, what does that really mean? I had no idea what it meant to be a doctor. And what motivated me was really to sort of reproduce how I grew up. So to me, becoming a doctor meant that I would have prestige and respect and be able to make an excellent living. And I never kind of thought beyond that about the day in and day out of what it looked like to be a physician. I started to think first when I went to college, and Wesleyan is a liberal arts institution, and I started to take, in particular, a course called Contemporary Psychoanalysis that I thought was on psychoanalysis, which I had grown up learning about and was very interested in from the time I was in middle school. And it turned out it was a misnomer. It was contemporary psychoanalysis was taught by a radical feminist dude named Bob Steele. And it was about really refuting everything Freud had said. And it was me arguing against 10 ardent feminists.
Oh my goodness.
And what it taught me to do, I spent about the first 5 classes arguing my position, and then with the readings I was doing and listening to the people in the class, I was like, maybe I should shut up and listen, and I'll learn something new. And it was really a course on critical theory, on pointing out the things in our culture that we don't see, because we're like fish in water, that joke that there's 2 fish and one is an aware fish and the other is not an aware fish, and the aware fish says the other fish, how's the water? And the unaware fish says, what's water? So I started to realize I was in water, and it started with feminism, the different ways that sort of a male-dominated culture created things like high heels and like all these things that I thought I had free will and yada, 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 that I started to see. And then it made me think about my choices. So I started to think of, why do I want to be a doctor? And I realized that I was an anxious person, and that if I was the prospect of telling a family that someone they loved was dying was more than I could fathom. So I had to.
I'm surprised you weren't thinking of psychiatry, though, since your dad was a psychiatrist.
I was, but you had to get through medical school.
That's true.
And you had to get through that. You rotate through everything. And I was just sort of chicken and young, and, sort of a false sense of confidence in some ways, but really started to, for the first time, think and question my motives. And I realized I didn't know if I could take those type of really people being physically ill and dying. And so I quickly thought, well, what's the most like being a physician, but without the dying. And then I thought, well, dentist. and, and I never even had any cavities. It was an unresearched decision. It was how to kind of stay the same and not rock the boat too much with my family, and not rock the boat too much. So I applied to medical school because I had to show my father that I could get in and save face. And I applied to dental school. And thank goodness I got into one medical school, and I got into Columbia Dental School. And I ultimately decided to go to Columbia Dental School. And the nice thing about that is the first 2 years were with the medical students. So I really had a full academic medical education, which I loved because, again, I loved science and biology and chemistry and anatomy. And I got to, I learned everything from head to toe. I had neuroscience, which served me later in my career. So it's not that I regret, well, what I should say is I became a dentist. As soon as I started working on people, I did not like dentistry. I thought maybe it was just school because they were kind of mean in dental school. And so I decided to finish. I did one more year at the VA hospital in Memphis just to make sure that it wasn't school that I didn't like, but that it was dentistry. And then I really, at the end of a very lovely year and working at the Veterans Hospital, the patients there are wonderful and grateful. And so it wasn't anything like that. I just didn't like the work, the work of and when I was at the VA hospital doing my internship in dentistry, what I ended up writing my paper was PTSD. So you could see that's where my head was. So that was all important. One, for the education, and two, the decision to leave dentistry was the first time I was a bad girl in my family, and I was really scared. And having survived bucking the status quo in that way and slowly figuring out who I was, kind of starting from ground zero, which took many, many years. In retrospect, having survived that was a very important experience and made me a better therapist today.
Yeah, well, like so many of us, your career was not in a straight line.
Exactly.
And but as you look back,
it's a zigzag.
Important learnings happened during that process of individuation, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So then I spent 10 years again trying to get successful in business because I thought if you're not a doctor, then you could be a lawyer. I didn't want to be that, or business. That didn't work. And then it was after 9/11 that I sort of reevaluated my priorities and thought, okay, I've been kind of chasing success and making money to support myself. And instead, why don't I do something that I'm interested in and hopefully I can make a living at it. And so I decided to go back to social work school and become a psychotherapist. And I decided to go the social work route because it was the quickest degree to be able to then work towards getting licensed. And I knew I would go right into psychoanalytic training after the 2 years of the master's. And that's what I did. And it was right before psychoanalytic training that I learned about this way that I now work, that I learned about emotions and trauma and attachment. And that's my background.
So it's interesting that you were eager to go into psychoanalytic training after that debunking experience that you had as an undergraduate. Somehow they did not succeed in totally brainwashing you to their point of view.
Well, that's such an interesting question, David, and you're right. It's a contradiction, but so I don't think at the time I was even thinking about that. What I was thinking about is, again, how to build a career. And in New York City, the sort of the highest level, the classical training, I thought, and certainly my family influence, was to become a psychoanalyst. That's how to, again, it's like a dancer becoming a ballerina first. Like, I felt that was the foundation that would legitimize my career.
Yeah, it's at the pinnacle.
Exactly,
right.
exactly. Mm-hmm. And I was ambitious, I guess. I don't think of myself that way, but I think obviously I am. So it's not like a drive necessarily that feels so conscious, but I think I like to be the best that I can be. And I take it very seriously, the idea of helping people. So I wanted to be highly educated to do that. And I thought becoming a psychoanalyst was the only way. I had never heard of other ways of working. I guess that's how insulated I was. Even, guess a little bit about CBT, but certainly not trauma therapies and experiential therapies. Not
So
until
you actually went through a very rigorous, demanding training in psychoanalysis,
Mhm.
4 years.
4 years, and lying on the couch as a patient, the
Okay.
three of them, 3 times a week with a
Yeah.
traditional Freudian analyst. And
Right.
yes,
And then at some point, you discovered the approach that you're now very passionate about,
yes,
AEDP, or Accelerated Experiential Dynamic Psychotherapy. There, I got
yes,
it out that
yes. It's a
time.
hard one. I know. Unfortunately, the acronyms are a
Yeah.
little
Yeah. So
cumbersome.
how did that happen?
So right after I graduated social work school, right before I was going to start at the Institute for Contemporary Psychotherapy, a friend of mine actually who also went back to social work school. We went back together. We met in junior high school. She said, "Hilary, I think you'd like this woman, Diana Fosha. You should really try to hear her speak." So I, sort of being, having the initiative that I looked up Diana Fosha, and there was an attachment conference in New York City down at I think it was at the Postgraduate Center. And I signed up and I went. And that was right before I was about to start my analytic training. And
Mhm.
that conference blew me away. I mean, I
Oh,
learned so much that I had never heard about before. And I think that's what struck me so much. Um, I That's why my education is relevant to what I do now and to my writing. Is I had the best psychological and biological and science education on the human body that money could buy, and never had I heard this whole branch of attachment theory, emotion theory, neuroscience, a little bit of neuroscience at Columbia, a little bit at Wesleyan, but nothing having to do with emotions, and something that was personally useful to me. So I left this conference being transformed, really, and I understood
mhm.
myself in a very new way. And I wondered, why doesn't everybody get this information? Why can't it? Why that it made sense that this was something that the public could benefit from in high school. We learned biology in high school. Why would we not learn some of these things that are actually useful on how to conduct ourselves, how to relate to ourselves, and how to relate to others?
Yes. Yeah.
So right after that conference, I was like, okay, I have to learn more about this. I have to go to psychoanalytic training. So I guess I'll do both. And I started to a parallel track of
Wow.
studying and reading experiential therapy,
Yeah.
bottom up processing, as it's called, where you, for non-therapists out there, for focusing more on the body and the lower parts of the brain to change the upper parts of the brain, the thinking parts of the brain,
Hmm.
versus therapies like psychoanalysis and CBT and DBT. And maybe people argue DBT focuses, but I think it's mostly a cognitive therapy, um, focusing on the thinking parts of the brain and hoping it will trickle down to affect emotion,
Yeah.
the body, and therefore impulses.
Yeah. There's several points I'd like to underscore here, if I can remember them all. One is that, is why have we spent so much time hearing about your background? And I think it's really, there are a lot of the people who listen to Shrink Rap Radio are in process,
Mm-hmm.
as on their way to becoming therapists, maybe students, maybe some other profession, and it's kind of in the back of their mind. And so, your career really underscores uh, that one can get there, and it can even be important to get there in a not totally direct way, to
Mm-hmm.
kind of listen to the different parts of yourself and try things out. So I think your journey is just a wonderful example of that. And
Oh, thank you.
what else did I want to underscore here? Part of my rationale for doing Shrink Rap Radio the way that I do it
Mm-hmm.
speaks to what you were saying. Well, why didn't I know about this?
Mm-hmm.
Why did I only know about psychoanalysis? And in fact, my doctoral program that I went through was psychoanalytically oriented way back when.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of rebelled against the narrowness of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so in some ways that probably fed what has ended up being Shrink Wrap Radio, an exploration on my part of, well, what else is out there, and
Mm-hmm.
who else, and what I've come to is that there are a lot of different approaches out there, and many of them have their own validity, and so I want to get the word out and sample, bring this smorgasbord, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
to potential listeners and to people who are early career, mid-career, whatever. So
Yeah,
those are,
I
there
think
may
that's
have been
great.
another idea in there, but I lost track of it. It'll
Yeah,
come
no,
back.
but I think that's really important. And I think, what I would like to then underscore on what you're just saying is that I think, there's no one, it's important not to say this is not good or this is the only way, that
Hmm.
because people are infinitely complex, and our experiences and the way we are wired is on some level the same, but on many levels different. Where emotions are concerned, one of the reasons I like them is that they're universal, but different methods work at different times in our lives. And it's important, while my stance is not like a psychoanalytic stance, and why I don't make interpretations the way I was taught, that education informs me every day and helped me tremendously. Everything I've read about CBT and DBT
Sure.
informs me. And I think it's important. So we're just wanting to add, like for me, the book that I wrote about emotion theory and stories of how people heal in this method is not to say this is better than something else, but really to say any therapist out there that's helping people to feel better, learn this too. Just get a taste of it and see how it feels. You don't even have to practice this way, but perhaps you'll refer, or perhaps you'll just get a sense that somebody can benefit from this. And the only way you have to know about it. So it's important.
Yeah. Now, speaking of books, you mentioned a book, and we're here today to talk about
Mm-hmm.
a book by you that's coming out later this month, or very
No,
soon, right?
it's
Or is it
soon,
already
February.
out?
It's February 6th in the United States and February 1st in the UK. And it's coming out in China and
Yeah.
Taiwan and South Korea, all these cool places.
How
So
exciting.
yeah.
So this book is titled "It's Not Always Depression,"
Mm-hmm.
which was the springboard for which was an article that you wrote for the New York Times.
Mm-hmm.
And I gather it must have sparked a lot of response to kind of fire you up to go on and take on the project of a book, which is not a
Mm-hmm.
small thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what were you getting at in that article? It's not always depression. That would seem to suggest that would be something about misdiagnosis, that people maybe are labeling things as depression that aren't, or help me with that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'm just going to sort of start with the punchline and then work backward
Okay.
which is that I think in our culture, depression and anxiety are rampant, and often people think that's the end of the story. I'm depressed. Okay, so
Mm,
now what can I do? I can take some medication to be undepressed. And there's some things, I can go for some therapy to get support. Same thing with anxiety. And what I guess, if there's anything to take away, is that I want people to know that's the beginning of the story, not the end of the story. So
mhm.
that there's a reason we are depressed, unless it's purely chemical. And I'm not sure anything is purely anything, that we're a combination of our genetics and our
Yeah, right.
disposition, and largely our experience, because our brain wires based on our experiences, for better and for worse. So the article that I wrote, I felt I had something to say, because I worked with not one but several people that had been diagnosed as depressed 20 years ago, and had every form of treatment for depression, and nothing worked. And they somehow found me, I guess, as an emotion. I think in my website, I talk about childhood trauma, and
Uh-huh.
that must resonate. And the people that came were like, okay, that resonates. So this particular person that I wrote the article about was someone like that, who had been through every, medication, cocktails of medication, in and out of psychiatric hospitals, DBT, CBT, supportive, psychoanalytic, every type of treatment, and nothing worked. And I didn't want to, so I had common sense, which Babette Rothschild, I don't know if you've ever spoken to her, says above all use common sense in psychotherapy, which I love. So my common sense told me, let's not repeat what's already been done. And
Yeah.
I reconfigured Brian, who the name I gave him in the article,
Right.
as someone who suffered childhood neglect and trauma, and was suffering as a result of being cut off from primary emotions and suffering shame, which I talk about as an inhibitory emotion and something that makes people sort of fold inward to themselves. And so in conceptualizing him this way, I treated him using AEDP, which is to help people get back in touch with their emotions. And then they start to become vital again. That the emotions are just the essence of who we are, how we feel alive and here. And he got better. And
Yay.
he got better. And
Yeah.
I wrote about it, and the article went viral. People resonated, and it makes sense that although I didn't expect that to happen, I didn't even expect the New York Times to publish it. I just kind of tossed it in. But I got lucky, and they did, and it went viral because these are universal phenomena that's why in the book I nicknamed this tool that I'm teaching called the change triangle. And it sort of shows how we work our way back to core emotions, and then how you can, when you get in touch and go through your emotions, you get in touch with your authentic self, and then they really start to happen. And the article
that was very intrepid of you to take this case on. I mean, what you were talking about common sense. Wouldn't common sense say, geez, a lot of other people have tried here. What makes me think I can do anything?
I guess I like a challenge, and I like to help people. And I know a lot of people haven't had AEDP. And
let's explode that a little bit. AEDP, accelerated. So in what sense is it accelerated? Does that mean it takes less time than other psychotherapies?
Yeah. I think it does take less time. That if you just think again logically, I can't, I'm speaking now from a psychoanalytic perspective, that the person would come in and just talk, and there would be very little guidance. I was taught not to direct people. And people naturally move into protective states. They don't go to the hard places, because if they could go to hard places by themselves, there wouldn't be a profession of therapists. So if you just let people go, I think there's a balance of giving space to talk. But if you let people go, it just takes a long time.
So you have to have a sense of where you're starting and
where you want to go,
where you want to end up, and some idea about how to get there.
Yeah, and that's what this triangle is in a nutshell. It's where are we going? Well, when someone is sharing something, and I'm looking not only for what they're saying, not the words, which matter, but 80% of communication is nonverbal. So they say, there's some research on that, although some might dispute that. But it makes sense to me that we're reading tone, we are reading body language, we're reading facial expressions. And so when I can look at someone when they're talking and see emotion in their face, and that is my cue to say something, like I'm so interested in what you have to say here. And would it be okay if we slowed down, really slow down, just to honor and validate the emotion that I think I'm seeing in your eyes? Are you aware of that?
Most people would want to just move, kind of keep moving and not focus on that.
If you don't say anything,
the clients,
past. They'll close. People will go because we're taught in our culture that we're really not supposed to lean into emotion. We're supposed to put it aside.
And so that begins to get at the experiential part of the 4 letters, right?
Yes.
That you're saying, let's slow this down and really experience what's going on with you.
Yes, exactly. So right here in the moment, instead of talking about, I had a feeling on Tuesday, here's the feeling right now. Let's make it safe and not
Mm.
shameful to be with that. And let's see what happens, that you'll probably feel a little bit better. And of course, everybody feels
Well, that's a great invitation. I mean, just you're saying that, let's make it safe. That
yeah,
feels very, very nurturing.
yeah,
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 I respond to that just hearing that, as a story.
yeah. Aw, and me too, right?
Yeah.
We're wired that way. It's
Uh-huh.
just, again, in the way that humans are more alike than not alike.
Yeah. Now it's interesting. The next word, AEDP,
Mm-hmm.
is dynamic,
Mm-hmm.
which really refers to going back to the psychoanalytic understanding of personality.
It does.
So
It
that wasn't a waste, because it turns out that the psychoanalytic conception of personality, I
does. Hmm.
think, is the most elaborated and pretty well established, I think.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And there is nothing about my for me, psychoanalytic training that I feel was a waste. And
Hmm.
not only that, it's very helpful technique-wise when people are stuck in more defended states. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, because defenses are very smart. They're there for a reason. They're there to protect us. And sometimes it can take a long time to help, depending on how much they were hurt as children, to
Yeah.
help them let down their defenses. And the psychoanalytic way of thinking is very helpful about enactments and things like that, and setting boundaries for people that were abused in some way. The frame and the being connected but boundaried, very, very important. And I learned that I learned the connection part from AEDP and the boundaried part from my
Hmm.
psychoanalytic training.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
so it was a great mix. And the history of analytic thought is a very interesting. I read the whole history of analytic thought. It's very uh, good stuff. Yeah,
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 it's
yeah.
very deep and rich.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, very rich.
Yeah. So, yeah, so let's see, where do we want to go from here? One of the things that stood out for me in your account in the New York Times article was that Brian was so removed and,
Mm-hmm.
as you correctly perceived, actually frightened and
Mm-hmm.
removed and afraid to engage because of early childhood trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very silent for long periods of time. And somehow you tossed him something, and a pillow or something, and
Mm-hmm.
kind of engaged him in playing ball in a way.
Mm-hmm.
I think you asked him, you said, how present are you right now?
Mm-hmm.
And he gave you a percentage,
Mm-hmm.
25% or something
Mm-hmm.
like that.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That before we can engage, even to feel safe and to know you're safe, you have to, the client has to show up in the room. And we all know that we can be present in a room and very easily escape
Yeah,
on
yeah.
multiple levels, right? The most extreme are dissociative states where you don't even know you're doing it. But we can tune out if you see, or, teenagers do it all the time. And just check out. It's like, I don't like this, so bye-bye. So,
Yeah, yeah.
but the question helped him know, again, it brought it to attention that he wasn't there. And the idea was, well, let's see if we can help you be more present in a way that feels, again, safe and not so vulnerable and exposed, because there's a huge difference. Again,
And after playing
yeah,
ball
yeah, I
for
tossed
a
him the
while,
pillow. Yeah.
it it brought him more into the room. And
Yeah.
it's interesting that he could share that with you, to kind of rate his degree of presence.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
But most people can do that.
I have to apologize, but
Yeah, I'm
I
so
got a
sorry. I know you're
I
getting
got a
over it.
cold. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm protecting you from the germs.
Thank you.
They might travel through the
Cyberspace.
wires. They talk about bugs in
Yeah,
computers.
yeah, that's right. That's funny. That's true. Oh no, I feel okay. So yes, that he knew how present he was. And he also, people have one of the things in AEDP that I find so refreshing is it's a healing therapy. And again, in my upbringing, the word healing, if I was in California, it may be different, but I would have recoiled from the word healing. That was too touchy feely. Now
Mm.
I understand, like in medicine, if I had been a doctor, I would have been trying to heal illness. And we're trying to heal the brain, the ways the brain forms an experience that are hurtful and wounding. So the way that to help him heal, I was saying that AEDP is a healing-oriented therapy where you're really trying to do specific things. And one of them is to create a safe attachment, because a safe attachment is the foundation through which all other healing work happens, emotion work happens. And by tossing the ball, it was a way to play, which feels safe, and we could laugh, and it made him feel in connection to me in a way that goes way back, to our childhoods, of where you can play safely.
Yeah.
And then it brings on all this, in the way Steve Porges talks about the social engagement system. You activate a certain, having to do with the vagus nerve, right? This is all the biophysiology of connection. But the idea here was to engage him in a way that felt good and connected, and that he would be able to show up a little bit more in a way that felt good, and start to build a new way of relating, a new neural network that wasn't based in trauma, but that was based in health.
Yeah, interesting too that you were talking about nonverbal before, and this was a nonverbal kind of technique. And I realized that it was familiar to me. I didn't immediately make the connection, but having been in old folks' homes, and sometimes that's a way to establish a connection with somebody, or in mental hospitals with people who were extremely regressed or whatever, and tossing them a ball, people who seem to be catatonic would reflexively, their hands would go up, they catch the ball, throw it back, and then that begins to build a bridge. And in fact, Brian, the case that you share with us in the article, he had a pretty traumatizing experience as a child. Maybe you can take us through some of that.
What are you remembering? I mean, I think I gave in the article a very broad brushstroke of emotional neglect, well-intentioned parents, some alcoholism in the family, but mostly benign neglect of a kid who must have, some people do well with, they don't need a lot of attention, they like the space. And other people in the same family interpret that as neglect. So, and in this family where there was, there were other factors too, but there was nothing that stood out. I think maybe that's why other people didn't question the history as much. They didn't know enough about really small t trauma is what we're talking about, that there wasn't anything catastrophic here that would make someone think of that. It was really the sense of not being seen, empathized, cared for in these deep ways that just did not agree with him. And he got worse and worse and worse. And then when you start to get labeled as the identified patient in your family, hospitalizations were traumatizing. Being labeled as chronically depressed in itself is traumatizing. Being on cocktails of medications and losing yourself and being numbed out and having side effects is traumatizing. So it's layers, and failed treatments where you take it on that there's something wrong with you, and the failure is really of a culture who doesn't understand emotions and attachment. And I hope to remedy some of that again by writing.
I seem to recall that one of my guests, I don't remember who sort of made the point that we all suffer from childhood trauma to some degree.
Yeah, I think I might have said that last week to you. I don't know.
No, it was before that.
Oh, was that? Okay, yeah.
But I'm glad to get some reinforcement.
I validate that. Yeah.
Yeah.
By surviving our childhood.
And when I think about that, well, why would that be the case? And part of it may be our culture, right? There's a lot of traumatizing stuff about growing up these days in this world. Yeah.
There really is.
Yeah.
There really is. And and maybe the word trauma, it conjures up such, catastrophic ideas that some people may recoil. We don't even have to use the word trauma. We could call childhood adversity, like ACEs, adverse childhood events, about the ACEs sort of philosophy.
It rings a bell. Go ahead.
Yeah. It's something I've just sort of recently learned about. They publish a lot of my writing, but it's adverse childhood events, so that they don't necessarily use the word small t trauma. They do. This is something, again, that is the culture at large does not know about. It's just beginning. And it's important to know, whatever you want to call it, is that getting, whether you're different as a kid. So it could be that you're a different type of learner, or that you are a different type of sexual orientation, or your gender, or your color in the neighborhood you live with, or you moved a lot, or you struggle in school. Anything that makes you different from your parents. I'm thinking of Andrew book, Not Far from the Tree.
Oh, yes.
Did you read, like, the first 40 pages of that was so great about how hard it is for parents when your children are not like you, and the tendency, because we're not, again, educated, is to make the kid gets the sense that there's something wrong with them, and that's the internalized shame, or just getting through divorce, or getting through changes that raise anxiety, gets internalized, that I feel bad, so there must be something wrong with me, or being bullied, or having a mean teacher. I mean, there's an infinite number of ways. And then the culture at large has so many ideas of how we should be. And if we don't measure up to those shoulds, again, we internalize it. There's something wrong with us. And these are all myths that sort of have to be busted. I want to be a myth buster about emotions and trauma, and there's many, many ways to be. I think if we all understand it, that nobody's bad here. We just have to get along and understand each other.
One of the highlights of your book is what you call the change triangle, or the inverted change triangle. Tell us about that, and how that, for example, applied in the case of Brian.
Okay. So just really quickly, the triangle is not anything that I invented or came up with. In fact, nothing in the book is. I'm a messenger. Just maybe the stories are my own, from my own work, but I'm a messenger of academic information that I've taken from the academic literature and teachings, and took out all the jargon and made it interesting, like a page turner to read, and so that anybody could absorb from it, both psychotherapists and the general public.
Well, that sort of book has been some of the most influential in the field and in the culture, because when they speak to the broader public, those ideas get disseminated. But go ahead.
That's exactly right. And then the public can start to ask for these things. So, so the triangle was a concept that David Mallon, who was a psychoanalyst in the 1970s, wrote about. It was an upside down triangle, and he called it the triangle of conflict. Then Diana Fosha, who was the developer of AEDP, adapted that triangle. She called it the triangle of experience. It's the same triangle. And I took that same triangle and nicknamed it for the public as a self-help tool, the change triangle, because to me, it's actually my good friend came up with the name because it's about change. It's about creating positive change. And so, it's a universal, it applies to everybody, all over the world, different cultures, it's just a universal experience. And it basically just diagrams the relationship between, at the bottom of the triangle are these biological, hardwired core emotions that we're born with that are universal. And then such as sadness, fear, anger, disgust, joy, excitement, and sexual excitement. Now, people will there's debate about what are the core emotions. When I was making this, I got to decide as a self-help tool, because I'm the one that was creating this, what's the most useful out there in the world? So I use the emotions that are usable for self-help. It doesn't really matter. So, for example, some people call surprise. I think Antonio Damasio lists surprise, and other people, maybe Ekman, surprise as a core emotion. And that's fine, but surprise is a momentary experience. It doesn't really necessarily cause trauma. What might cause trauma is shock. But so I put the emotions down that, like sadness, fear, and anger, that cause, when they're blocked, sustaining problems. And so the idea is that we all want to get in touch with our core emotions. And in a way, the way I now define mental health and wellness in my work and for myself is, if I can teach someone to tolerate and experience the 7 core emotions and make use of them, they're in pretty good shape. But what happens is, when we're born, in order to become civilized and connect with our families and our cultures, we have to block our emotions to please others. And so we have these inhibitory emotions, which I talked about in the New York Times article, which are anxiety, guilt, and shame. And those will block our experience of ourselves. And another way to think of it that's useful is, core emotions are selfish. They're all about what's good for me. And inhibitory emotions are what's better for fitting in and getting along in my family and in my relationships. And because core emotions down here and inhibitory emotions on the upper right are physical experiences, and they don't feel good in the body. If you can see, I'm kind of going like this because they feel, they're painful at times. Then we develop defenses as a way to protect ourselves. And that's the last corner of the triangle, are how we block and defend against emotions to protect ourselves. So by definition, I'm calling a defense anything we do to avoid a painful experience. And so as we get through our childhoods, we start our life down here. Core emotions are in the body, right? That's why the bottom of the triangle here. And then we have to get along in our families, and slowly we move up. We block them with anxiety, guilt, and shame. And then we start to spend a lot of our life in our defensive modes, where we're out of touch with what we're feeling down here. And we lose touch with ourself. And when
are there words over here that associated, like denial, or what are the words?
Yeah. So in the book, there's so many. So defenses range from denial to being vague to joking to looking at your screen all the time, up through having a drink or a drug or working too hard or cutting yourself. I think of depression as a defense, even though some people, again, might not like that, but I mean it again in the way that depression shuts us down. We're out of touch with our core emotions, precisely because the emotions, there was nowhere for them to go. They're too painful, and people need help feeling their feelings. And so Brian was in a shutdown, shame-based depression, and he defended himself by shutting down. That even though that was painful, it was at least familiar and kind of safe. And I've had other patients talk about the safety of their depression. They're kind of down in a well in their own hole, and even though it's miserable, it's the idea of coming out into the world is just terrifying. And so it's sort of the lesser of the two evils. Obsessions, compulsions, again, by definition, and the audience out there, and you could, I would encourage you, what's your own list of the defenses that you've seen in your friends, family, and if you can be very brave, in yourself. Sort of a lot easier
to see it in other people.
Always easier to see it in ourselves. And that's intellectualizing is a defense. So again, it runs the gamut. There's an infinite number of ways to, eating disorders, avoidance of any kind. You get the point, right?
Yeah.
And in the book, I tell all these stories, and we take you through the triangles. I list different defenses and whatnot. for about
Now,
7.
you described this as a self-help book.
Mm-hmm.
Given the tendency that you noted earlier that
Mm-hmm.
we tend to avoid the painful places,
Mm-hmm.
and that part of the therapist's job is to challenge us to move into those places that we would rather not go to.
Mm-hmm.
Where does a self-help book fit into that? If
Great
right,
question.
like,
I'm
is
with you.
that possible even?
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
totally with you. Okay. So 2 things: that the intellectual education, what people will learn by what I share, will be news to many, many, many people, and it'll be validating. It's going to help to get rid of stigma. Like in our culture, just the idea that emotions are involuntary biological responses that we can't control is news, because I was raised, and I thought, it wasn't directly told to me, but I thought that I was supposed to control my emotions. So when people say to other people, get over it, or, stop it, like stop indulging yourself, it's just, it's not reasonable. It's just not true. It's a myth that we cannot stop emotions from firing in the brain. We have our 5 senses, right? Our sight, our hearing, touch, smell, taste, what we see, and these come into our brain, and based on how we perceive the environment as safe or as pleasurable, it's going to fire an emotion in the middle of our brain. It's going to go down into our body to elicit a whole host of physiological bodily reactions that ready us for action. This is how we evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to be able to survive as a species, so that the survival of these emotions are critical, and they happen. And it's only after they're happening that the information goes up to our thinking brain, our cerebral cortex, and that this is the work of Bud Craig and others, that we know now we can say, okay, I'm having this experience of sadness. But there's no way to prevent, if there's a loss to you personally, you're going to feel sad. If somebody pokes you or threatens you, it's going to elicit anger and fear. If somebody is toxic, you're going to have a disgust reaction. And disgust probably was one of the earliest emotions, happened so that we wouldn't eat poisonous berries and poisonous food. So it's there, it's very primitive, and yet we have these same reactions in modern life. And it's more complicated in modern life because we might be frightened and our adaptive action is to run. And yet in modern life, let's say public speaking, we can't run. We have to be courageous and deal with our fear. So the change triangle is it's a prescription. It's one in education, because I believe psychoeducation really does help. If it does nothing, it reduces shame and stigma. And then for me, dealing with my emotions was much less scary when somebody explained to me, when I was in training, the phenomenology of how there's a predictable way that emotions arise. And the fact that I feel them in my body, I never knew that. I never knew emotions were physical sensations. But once somebody told me that, I was like, of course they are. I feel them physically.
Yeah.
Therefore, then you don't have to be as frightened of these weird experiences in your body. So there's many, many things that just the intellectual learning of this information will do for people.
Yeah. So I'm recalling from our previous discussion that
Yeah.
we ended up not putting out there, that you spent a lot of time with Brian.
Mm-hmm.
It said about 1.5 years doing, quote, psychoeducation.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of normalizing the things that he was
Mm-hmm.
experiencing and
Mm-hmm.
putting it into a cognitive framework.
Mm-hmm.
And so I understand that that's an important part of how you
Mm-hmm.
work, and that the
Yeah.
book is getting people along that part of it.
Right.
It's helping them to start on the path that may eventually take them to a therapist.
Exactly. To sort of get on board. And I explain how people change, neuroplasticity. I explain trauma. I explain emotions. I talk a little bit about anxiety, guilt, and shame. Again, all from an intellectual perspective.
Yeah.
And then I pepper it with stories that show how verbatim how I work the change triangle with people in session. And
Good.
I think they're going to have an experience. You readers out there you will not be the same person after you read the book as you were before. I don't think it's possible, because you're going to have a left brain, right brain, 1-2 punch. And then there's also exercises, I call them experiments, so that you can work this. So there's no question that if you've got trauma, you're going to get stuck at any particular place in the triangle, but you'll know what's to be done next. So you can either get that help from a therapist, but I also believe, in my wildest fantasies, people can read this book together. It talks about attachment. Also, that's another sort of intellectual chapter, but again, no jargon. So I don't want it to scare anyone. I imagine change triangle peer groups, or I even researched, there's something called Emotions Anonymous. Like, I think you can put together groups where people can read the book and then work the change triangle together. I think partners, romantic, intimate partners or friends can read the book together and do this themselves. I think there is a lot people can do on their own. And when they get stuck, they'll know that this type of therapy exists. And hopefully more people will want to train this way. And it's just
fascinating. And what about for therapists? I know that you are a supervisor, right? So you do workshops and train therapists. Do you think that this book has the potential to be instructive to therapists?
I do. And Diana Fosher wrote the foreword for the book. So she's totally supportive. And I think that many therapists will read the book. And I think especially I like academic jargony stuff. It doesn't bother me because of all the science reading I did early on, but a lot of people can't get through academic writing. And this, again, I wrote it. My mother has a pet peeve against jargon, so she's been shaming the jargon out of me for years. And I used to yell at her, but now I thanked her in the book because it really helped me become a writer. I was never a writer until really for the last maybe the last 5 years. That it's really easy to read, really simple language. I think therapists will be able to learn a lot from it. Just to clarify, David, I don't do workshops. I do one-on-one and some small group supervision. I'm shy. You may not be able to tell by now. I haven't really done workshops, but I'm going to be speaking about the book, and I'm excited. That's one thing that I feel happy to be able to talk about is
great. Well, this might be the place for us to wrap this up. I don't know if we've covered it all. Is there any one last thing that comes to mind that you want to be sure to shoehorn in here?
I think you covered a lot. Your questions were great. And I just would encourage people to visit. What I'd love is if you're interested in what I've been talking about, is to come to my website, which you could get there from hilaryjacobshendel.com. Is that okay to say? You can also get there to thechangetriangle.com. I have free resources. I write a blog. And if you want to know when the book comes out, you can join my email list, and I don't spam. All I do is send a blog once a month because I don't like to get a lot of email in my box. So I'm respectful of that. And I would love people to join my list and stay connected. And I love feedback, and I love if people have things they want me to write about and I think I can do a good job, they can communicate with me through Facebook at my Facebook page or Twitter. I'm loving the engagement.
Well, you're probably going to get a lot of engagement as you put yourself out into the world in this way.
Yeah.
And I sure wish you all the luck and that good things return to you as a result. So
thank you so
I really
much.
want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you, David. It was wonderful. Thank you.